So an interesting question which is posed here in the context of using our super keyword, and this is of course a program that we had in the previous video, which essentially has B extends A, and B essentially has a constructor with something inside it, and B essentially calls on the super constructor, and we have various overloaded constructors here for the super constructors, which are sort of condensed within the super class, or also called the parent class. And so essentially, we're calling one constructor, and we notice that we can essentially grab whatever constructor we want. We could grab the default constructor that would signify to grab this constructor here. We could grab this the single parameter constructor um, by just loading in an integer, and that would essentially signify that we're wanting to grab this constructor, or we could grab this constructor from the superclass by loading by loading two integer values, right? Which is what we had at the beginning of the program. And so we're really picking and choosing which constructor we want to call from the superclass, knowing that we really can't call all three. But that's really the question here. Why can't we call all three? Well, recall that a very important rule for the super keyword is that the super keyword must be the first line or first statement in a constructor, right? And so what I really mean by this is, I mean, this works completely fine, right? On line 6 here, this works. But if I were to make this the second line here, I would actually get an error. It wouldn't work. And so what you notice is, so here I'm calling the default constructor, right? But if I were to have another super keyword, if I were to do super um, 10, where I'm actually signaling to call both the default and the single parameter constructor, I mean that would be problematic, right? Because now the super keyword is actually the second, right? So there's one super keyword on the first line, on line number 6, and there's also another super keyword or method on line 7, and essentially now one of the supers is the second statement in a constructor, and so that really essentially violates that rule there that the super keyword must be the first statement in a constructor. And so in order to sort of combat that, what we can do is if we wanted to actually call all those constructors, what we would essentially do is we would make more objects, right? Um, we would make more objects essentially, and so we have one constructor here, and then we have public B again, and this public B essentially calls super. It actually calls that constructor, which is essentially taking in, um, that value of, let's see. So it would, I mean, obviously, what we'd want to do is we'd want to pass in that variable, and that would essentially take in that value for. So okay, so what we do is we would pass in a value here, and then that value would essentially be the integer which we would be taking from the super. So I would be that integer, which would be here in the constructor for the single parameterized constructor. And the same thing would essentially apply to public B int I and int j, and we're really trying to target that constructor which is taking two integers, right? I, j, okay. And now, I mean, you can see that we're now equipped with the ability to sort of take in the default, the single, and the double parameterized constructors, and we sort of want to match that here in our main method, right? And so here we could just do one variable, and here we could do two variables. Okay, let me actually just change them to multiples of 5 just because I have OCD, but excellent. So these values are essentially sent back to the constructors, and those constructors sent them back to the superconstructor, and the superconstructor essentially just prints whatever's inside the values or the methods there. And so then we get all this junk, which if you want to take the time to pause the video, you can sort of match that or map that back to really what the source is, the origin. And by origin, I really just mean because we're going into the method and we're actually going inside the method and then referring back to the super method from which actually has precedence, and then we're coming back to the constructor and then doing whatever's inside here. So yeah, I mean that's really how we sort of print out or get all three. We just essentially just want to do what we did on the first constructor, but 2 times, or however many times there are constructors of different parameters, and we want to match those corresponding parameters in order to reflect a proper super method, right? We can't actually grab something that's not there, or we can't actually grab anything which doesn't specify if it's default or not, and that's how we do that. So